Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on carbon management, hydrogen, and procurement legislation. My name is Emma Thomley, and I'm a program specialist on the Great Plains Institute's Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Aland Hadland, a program associate for our Industrial Innovation Initiative. Next. For those of you familiar with the Great Plains Institute, we also wanted to share an exciting announcement that our carbon management team recently underwent a name change and is now the Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team to better reflect the work we do on industrial decarbonization and our work to continue to meet GPI's goals of accelerating the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. Next slide. So today we'll be covering a lot of ground. I'm going to start with a brief overview of our legislative resources. Then for carbon management, I'll share broader trends from 2022 and 2023 before diving into a recap of 2024 legislation and a preview of what's ahead for 2025. Then Alana will do the same for both hydrogen and procurement. We'll have dedicated time for Q&A at the end, but please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. And we'll also be sharing the slides and recording after today's webinar. And if you have follow-up questions, please feel free always to reach out to me and Alana by email. Also, just to clarify our terminology, when I say carbon management during today's webinar, that includes legislation related to carbon capture, carbon removal, including direct air capture, CO2 transport, utilization, and storage. Hydrogen generally refers to policies supporting low carbon or clean hydrogen, or any legislation that touches hydrogen infrastructure and projects. And then procurement covers low carbon procurement, not all state procurement. Next. So GPI offers several legislative resources that might be helpful for you. The first of these is our legislative tracker, which we've developed for 2023, 2024, and 2025. Our goal for this tracker is to provide easy access to bills for everyone that have real-time updates. And when you access the tracker, you'll see a map and a sheet with a list of bills. So all you need to do is click on a state to view all relevant legislation being considered for that state. Next. Or you can use filters to search by topic, state, bill status, and more. One of the benefits of this tracker is that it updates automatically, allowing you to stay informed on fast-moving legislation. And there are direct links to each bill for easy access. And this year, we've also added GPI summaries for each bill. Since we don't feature every single bill in our legislative digest, this provides a way to quickly identify any provisions related to carbon management, hydrogen, and procurement that might be relevant to your work. Next. We also track notable bills, provide summaries, and send out updates in our state legislative digest, typically on a weekly basis starting in February. So if you'd like to stay informed on any of those bills, please feel free to reach out to either me or Alana and subscribe. Next. Now, if you're looking for somewhere to see a comprehensive overview of state regulations, you can use our state web map, which shows what the state has done on carbon management across a few different categories. Unlike our legislative trackers, it only covers carbon management, and it doesn't direct you to past legislation. It directs you to state code. I find this web map particularly useful if I'm trying to cite code or if I'm looking to compare policies across different states. But as of right now, it is only updated through 2022, so be sure to review our 2023 and 2024 legislative trackers to ensure you're not missing out on anything. GPI is considering updating this resource or potentially adding hydrogen and low carbon procurement. So if that's something that would be useful to you or any of the people that you work with, please feel free to send me a note so we know that that's a good priority for our team. Next slide. Here you can just see what it looks like when you click on a state and what those different topic areas will look like and how you can access state code. Next slide. All right, before diving into the carbon management portion of today's webinar, I wanted to share some context about the number of bills introduced between 2022 and 2025. You might be thinking, Emma, why haven't I heard about these hundreds of bills? And one thing to note is that many of them are near duplicates or just duplicates. They've either been introduced in both legislative chambers or there are minor differences in definitions or language. We track all of them because occasionally those small differences matter, but it's worth keeping in mind as you listen to today's presentation that the true ratio of enacted to introduced bills would be lower if we accounted for those similarities. And that brings me to my final point before I dive into carbon management. We know that many of you are deeply engaged in specific states. You're either drafting legislation or advocating for or opposing certain pieces of legislation. And while we're going to do our very best to answer your questions today, you probably know some of these bills more in depth than we do. Our goal is to share the information we have and support your efforts. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you found any bills that we're not tracking. Next slide. Okay, here are these bills again for carbon management. You'll notice that they've been steadily increasing over the past couple of years. We're only about a month and a couple of weeks into session and already have 60 bills being considered. So I'm anticipating that this year's bills will probably stay around the same or more than what we've seen in 2024. Next. I wanted to briefly touch on 2022 because there was a notable increase in the number of bills compared to 5 years earlier, just reflecting growing attention to carbon management generally. We saw states like Utah, California, West Virginia, and Indiana passing comprehensive legislation addressing pore space ownership, unitization, and long-term liability. Interestingly, and part of the reason I wanted to touch on 2022 today, very few bills, maybe one or two, were introduced to restrict CO2 transport. California was a notable exception here. They introduced a bill and passed it that included provisions on a temporary moratorium on CO2 pipelines. But this lack of CO2 transport related bills generally is something to keep in mind as we look at the next couple of years. By the end of 2022, carbon management legislation had been introduced or enacted across the nation in both proactive climate states and traditional energy producing regions. Next slide. So let's talk about the legislative momentum around carbon management in 2023. As shown on this slide, the number of bills introduced nearly doubled compared to the prior year, likely catalyzed by developments in the second half of 2022, most notably the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which enhanced the 45Q tax credit levels, as well as several funding opportunity announcements. These opportunities likely injected significant momentum into the carbon management landscape broadly and created awareness in states of the economic potential these projects could bring. Additionally, in many states, particularly the Midwest, we saw a jump in legislation to address concerns about safety and property rights related to CO2 transport. However, it's important to note that while we saw this jump in bills restricting CO2 transport, they were not widely reflected in the enacted legislation in 2023. Next slide. Which brings us to 2024. Those bill numbers keep going up, although slightly fewer states in total enacted bills in 2023, even though that enacted number itself went up. We're seeing a lot more states going back and modifying existing regulations, and as always, a few states that are introducing comprehensive legislation for the first time. Next slide. All right, this slide highlights the trends that we saw in CO2 transport bills in 2024. As in 2023, as news about carbon management transport projects continued, we saw a considerable increase in legislation across the Midwest, with many of these bills specifically relating to pipelines. We saw bills introduced that aim to prohibit CO2 pipeline construction or establish moratoriums. Many of those bills focused on restricting eminent domain, or they centered on landowner protections, environmental safeguards, and improving transparency in the permitting process. However, even in 2024, most of those restrictive CO2 transport bills didn't advance very far. And these enacted bills that you're seeing on the slide are either small wording in more general legislation or making minor changes. There were two notable exceptions, though. The first of these exceptions was Illinois Senate Bill 1289, which established a moratorium on pipeline construction until July 2026, or PHMSA safety rules were updated. And then secondly, South Dakota enacted Senate Bill 201, which created a landowner bill of rights for CO2 pipelines, stipulated how deep pipelines had to be buried, and had a number of provisions related to damages. I think it's pretty safe to say that these bills show that states are continuing to refine their regulatory frameworks in response to the dual priority of advancing carbon management, but also addressing public concerns about safety, property rights, and environmental impact. Next slide. All right. I also wanted to point out that several bills introduced last year highlight growing concerns about the environmental and safety risks of CO2 injection in sensitive areas, including sole source aquifers and wetlands. While these bills didn't advance past introduction, they reflect ongoing concerns about the environmental impact of carbon management and could have major implications if similar bills were enacted in the future. So they're just good to be aware of. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to take a look at some bills focused on support and other incentives for carbon management. States are exploring a few different ways to support potential projects. You'll notice some bills included provisions on utilities, others on grant programs, some on tax credits, and then others on appropriations. However, we're not really seeing any strong trends with enactment of these bills outside of appropriations. In each of these categories, most have only seen one bill enacted. Appropriations are funding a wide range of initiatives, from storage studies to technical training platforms and state programs for Class 6. And I think overall just reflect sort of a direct way for states to invest in carbon management and align with their climate goals. Next slide. All right, so something we track pretty closely each year are provisions on unitization or amalgamation, which is the process by which underground pore space is mandated to be combined for a project, typically if an operator does not get consent from all landowners. Of the 8 states that introduced unitization bills this year, 6 of those successfully enacted those bills. I think generally showing that when a state decides to address this gap, they can generally garner the support that they need. A common feature of these enacted bills is a requirement for consent varying from 60 to 75% of pore space owners for unitization, which isn't out of the norm for states that have already enacted bills on this. I did want to point out that 3 bills in Illinois sought to prohibit unitization altogether, but those failed to move beyond the introduction stage. Interestingly, Michigan introduced a bill proposing to exempt state lands from forced unitization, but that legislation also did not advance. And then finally, ownership of pore space is typically a focus in these discussions. Most bills, unless the state has already enacted provisions related to pore space ownership, or have other bills moving on that topic, affirm that the pore space ownership is vested with the surface owner unless it has been previously severed in some other way. Next slide. All right. Let's talk about post-closure requirements and long-term liability for geologic carbon storage. So risk management provisions generally have varied pretty widely between states. However, we saw a few states act on this in 2024. West Virginia extended its liability transfer period from 10 to 50 years post-closure, or to a time frame determined by its Department of Environmental Protection. Pennsylvania similarly required 50 years, while Alabama maintained a 10-year post-closure period. Michigan and New Mexico also introduced bills related to long-term liability, but they didn't specify timeframes, and neither of those bills were enacted. As for post-closure specifications, within these bills, most states outline a set of requirements that operators must fulfill before liability can be transferred to the state, and these typically must be completed even if a project reaches sort of that year marked in legislation. These include monitoring, maintenance, and ensuring the safety and integrity of the site. However, even after liability officially transfers to a state, we've typically seen that a state is not going to assume responsibility if malpractice or any form of negligence is discovered, and operators remain accountable for any violations or damages caused during or after the project. Next slide. All right, I wanted to briefly note that across states, carbon storage funds are being established or modified to help fund, regulate, monitor, and manage CO2 storage projects throughout their life cycle. These funds are typically used to cover state administrative expenses or to monitor active and closed storage facilities, and generally just to ensure the long-term site safety post-closure. Next slide. All right, before I leave 2024, I just wanted to cover some general trends that we saw in enacted legislation. We saw a lot of movement on geologic storage regulations, with states refining policies around pore space ownership, unitization, and long-term liability. At the same time, financial mechanisms like those trust funds I just mentioned are being set up or expanded to handle long-term monitoring and post-closure care. And finally, states are working to either boost economic incentives or strengthen safety regulations, whether that's through an intention to get Class 6 primacy or to just enact stricter siting and environmental protections. And with that, I am going to move to 2025, but just know that this was just a snippet of what was introduced. And if you're curious about I think it was the 129 bills considered during 2024. Please go to the 2024, look at the tracker, take a look at those summaries, and reach out to me with any questions. Okay, so looking ahead to 2025, we're continuing to see more and more states revisit and refine existing regulations. So far, at least 18 states have introduced legislation, with a notable concentration in the Midwest and Mid-Continent area. There's been a pretty huge surge in bills early in the 2025 session, but generally that's expected. This is typically when we see the highest volume of introductions, and activity will probably slow within the next couple of months. Next slide. I wanted to touch on carbon dioxide transport again, because about a third of the bills introduced in 2025 so far mention it in some way. And so we're seeing a continuation of those legislative trends that started in 2023 surrounding CO2 pipelines. Most of these are in the Midwest, and many of the bill's proposed provisions aimed at increasing oversight, addressing public safety, and reevaluating industry privileges. So a few examples of that include proposals for risk modeling, stricter safety requirements, again, waiting for updated regulations from PHMSA. Those are often accompanied by temporary moratoriums on pipeline construction. Other bills are taking a closer look at eminent domain and tax exemptions. Despite this level of activity, so far, we're not seeing that these measures are progressing significantly in state legislators. So I think while, again, these bills are reflective of growing caution and public concern related to CO2 transport, as of right now, they've generally failed to advance beyond initial stages. But we're still early in session, so that may change. Next slide. I wanted to highlight the variety of other bills being introduced beyond the usual sort of carbon management provisions that we talk about. We're seeing some focused on low carbon fuel standards, others mentioning incentives for sustainable aviation fuel. A few bills are addressing direct air capture, though there aren't many major regulatory bills in that area. However, I did want to note that one bill in North Dakota has been proposed to prohibit the construction of a DAC facility. So that's just something to be aware of. Additionally, several states are proposing programs that in some way support carbon management. For example, in Hawaii, there's an initiative to sort of assess the state's underground carbon storage and water resources. And then this is pretty similar year to year, but we're also seeing a few states propose different studies that they'd like to do to sort of close the knowledge gap on carbon management. This year, for example, we've seen a couple of studies looking to pair nuclear with DAC or hydrogen. Next slide. All right, I wanted to just touch briefly on a couple of the bigger bills that I'm seeing this year. So this bill out of Oklahoma covers several aspects of carbon storage regulation. For unitization, it sets the threshold at 63% consent from pore space owners. On public notice procedures, it requires announcements 50 and 30 days before hearings and includes a publication in local newspapers. Direct air capture is also mentioned in the bill, sort of expanding the scope of eligible technologies. A revolving fund is established to support various carbon storage activities, and it also provides for the plugging of unused injection wells. And then finally, just want to note that for Oklahoma, they've established sort of this 50-year benchmark, at which point liability could be transferred to the state post-well closure. Next slide. All right, so Indiana has introduced several bills this session aimed at refining carbon storage and transport regulations. House Bill 1104 would increase the unitization threshold from 70 to 85% of that pore space ownership and raise the annual injection fee. It would also limit pipeline length for a project to 30 miles. So good to be aware of that bill. Senate Bill 0547 establishes a permitting process for wells. And then House Bill 1517 sets a 15-day timeline for involuntary unitization orders to take effect once a Class 6 permit has been granted. And I hadn't seen a provision like that before. That same bill would also create a carbon storage trust fund and administrative fund to cover operational expenses for the state. Next. Just wanted to briefly touch on this for anyone who's following Utah. Wanted to note that Utah keeps doing primacy preparation. This bill specifically just notes which agency would have enforcement authority. Next slide. Okay, Illinois has also introduced legislation strengthening restrictions on CO2 pipeline development. Previously, and I mentioned this past bill earlier, construction was delayed until PHMSA had updated its rules or until July 2026. But under this new bill, no pipelines can be built before July 2026, and they can only be built if PHMSA updates its safety rules. The bill also sets a compensation requirement for landowners impacted by pipeline construction, ensuring sort of reasonable compensation for damages, land restoration, soil compaction, and drainage tile repairs. And it also establishes equitable compensation for those non-consenting pore space owners in the unitization process for a storage project, just ensuring that they receive payments comparable to those consenting landowners. All right, and last but not least, Colorado also introduced a bill establishing a geologic storage stewardship enterprise to oversee the long-term management of CO2 storage facilities, and they created an enterprise board to administer that program. I also wanted to point out that for site closure under this bill, once ownership of the injected CO2 and infrastructure transfers to the state, operators are released from regulatory liability, but they do remain responsible for civil, criminal, or contractual obligations. But at that point, the state will assume long-term stewardship. And with that, I will turn it over to Alana to talk about hydrogen.
Thanks, Emma. And thanks again to everyone who's tuning in today. So as Emma said, now we're going to look at the hydrogen legislation that we've tracked. For our tracking purposes, as Emma shared earlier, we're primarily focused on hydrogen that would fall under clean, renewable, occasionally low carbon, or related to hydrogen infrastructure more broadly. One thing I'll note is that each bill typically does provide definitions for the various topics related to clean hydrogen or hydrogen more broadly that are being addressed within the legislation for that particular state. And then some of these hydrogen bills might specifically address clean hydrogen, while others might focus on renewable energy more broadly in the state. And in other cases, hydrogen is part of a much larger piece of legislation like appropriations. So that's really just something to keep in mind as we discuss hydrogen bills today. And then before diving in, I'll just reiterate what Emma said, that we know that many of you are working very closely in specific states or on specific pieces of legislation. So if you are more familiar with details and the history, that will not surprise us, but really encourage you to not hesitate to reach out to us directly. Our goal here is to support your work and share what we've tracked so far, but we would welcome conversation about how we can collaborate further. So looking here, again, this shows hydrogen legislation that we've tracked from 2022 to 2025. You'll notice that this more than doubled from 2022 to 2023, and then slightly dipped in 2024. And as Emma shared as well, we are a little less than 2 months into the 2025 session and are already tracking 21 bills. So we're anticipating seeing considered bills be near what we saw last year, if not higher. And many factors can contribute to changes in the number of bills being considered. So Emma had referenced the bipartisan infrastructure law as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. What I want to do is just highlight one specific example of something that was happening at the federal level during the time that we saw that spike. And simply, again, just as an example to share the interplay between the federal and the state policy and activity landscape. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, wonderful. And that's the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub program. So I suspect many are familiar with this, but just a high-level overview to compare the timeline. In September of 2022, we saw the $7 billion federal announcement, which was funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law. December of 2022, the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations sent encourage and discourage notifications to those who had submitted concept papers. In April of 2023, full applications were due. Later that year in October, selected projects were announced. And then just last summer, we started to see those award announcements begin. So the two maps below are shared just to provide that geographic comparison. On the left, we can see the 7 regional hubs that were selected by DOE in 2023. And then on the right, we can see the states that were considering legislation related to hydrogen in 2023. So again, this is not intended to draw any specific conclusion, but just provide a helpful vantage point when we are considering that interplay between policy and activity happening at the federal level and then also at the state level. Next slide, please. Okay, 2024 feels like a long time ago, but it wasn't. So here we are looking at 52 bills related to hydrogen that were considered across at least 17 state houses. Of those 52 bills, we tracked 15 that were enacted. And Emma had alluded to this as well, but those considered bills would include any companion bills or bills that were introduced in both chambers, not officially as companion bills. So just to keep in mind what that considered bill number represents. So again, the range of hydrogen, it might be specific to hydrogen, it might be about renewable energy more broadly, and these bills may be part of like a budget or appropriations bill. So I'll just give you a moment here to look at that map for another second, and then we'll look at some details. One other thing I'll note with hydrogen is that it may take on a little bit more of a narrative approach, especially with clean hydrogen. Hydrogen itself is a very familiar fuel, but conversation around clean hydrogen, what that is and what that means in the States has definitely gained a lot of traction just over the past few years. So that's just, again, something to keep in mind as we look at trends. Next slide, please. Okay, wonderful. So beginning with considered but not necessarily or not enacted legislation. And a fair question is why look at trends in bills that did not pass. Um, it starts to tell a story, right? It shows that conversations are happening around clean hydrogen at the state level. And as we'll move on to shortly, a lot of the trends we see in enacted legislation mirror what we see in bills that may not be enacted. I think what that starts to show is that just because a bill was not enacted in a session, it doesn't mean that topic is off the table, particularly with topics that are newer, like clean hydrogen. It's not uncommon to see a bill that was considered but not enacted be reintroduced in the future. So, with each state being so unique, a topic like clean hydrogen can just take time to gain traction and gains traction at different rates due to a variety of different factors. So, just a reminder, conversations are happening and states are actively considering what will be feasible in their respective locations. The first trend is around studies and reports. So those are just some examples of terms that we pulled from multiple states that considered bills that would direct usually a designated government body or a third party like a university to study topics related to clean hydrogen. So just an example, the first one would be gas quality standards for injecting renewable hydrogen into the common carrier system. That's pretty specific, whereas other studies would be more broad. For example, the economic and policy impacts of hydrogen for clean transportation. An example here is listed from Iowa. Again, this bill was considered but did not pass in that session. It would propose establishing an interim energy policy study focused on several different energy topics in the state. Hydrogen hubs were included in those. So that's also a nod again to that federal and state interplay. The next trend is around financial incentives and support. So again, pulled some of the keywords that we're seeing come up in multiple bills considered across multiple states. A very common one that we'll talk about more when we get to procurement are tax credits, exemptions, and different preferential costs or rates. An example there from Hawaii, that bill proposed creating a hydrogen fuel replacement tax credit. And then moving on to definition, use, and authority. So again, clean hydrogen being a newer conversation. This is really about defining what it is, what acceptable applications or end uses in the state would be, and then what entities have authority when it comes to determining either the permitting and siting or the use of that clean hydrogen. An example from Pennsylvania, a legislation was introduced in both chambers. This was unique in that it sought to amend the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act of 2004, but again, just pointing to the fact that they were specifically looking to define clean hydrogen and the role and classification tier that it would play within the state's alternative energy portfolio. And last but not least, permitting and siting, a more familiar category here, but an example here from Massachusetts. This bill, that's not all that this bill provided for, but within it, it proposed that the Department of Energy Resources would be the one to be able to review and approve the siting of renewable hydrogen production and delivery facilities and infrastructure. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to look at bills that were enacted in 2024. And again, I mentioned that we see similar trends across these. We imagine those will probably get a little bit more specific as we continue to track these year over year. But back to that trend of different studies and reports, two examples, one in Louisiana where we saw a clean hydrogen task force created, and then in Maine, we saw a clean hydrogen pilot program established. Within financial support and incentives, an example from Wyoming, this was part of a much bigger budget bill, but it did provide matching funds for private or federal research, development, and demonstration, different types of pilot projects, or commercial deployment projects. And these were all related to the state's broader energy needs, but it did include hydrogen hubs within. So once again, that nod to some of the federal and state interactions. The next trend related to permitting and siting, we saw South Dakota pass a bill that will require hydrogen pipelines to be permitted by the Public Utility Commission. And then last but not least, around that topic of definition, use, authority, in Washington, we saw them authorize that public utility districts can produce, sell, and transport both renewable natural gas, green electrolytic hydrogen, as well as renewable hydrogen. Next slide, please. All right, 2025. So one thing we wanted to note, at least 21 bills, as we mentioned earlier, are already being considered related to hydrogen, and that's across 13 different state houses. One thing I wanted to mention that has stood out so far is that there are a number of states with bills that have already been introduced in both chambers. So just wanted to note that while bipartisan support can obviously help with the momentum and passage of bills, it's just interesting to note that states are introducing in both chambers. There are obviously some strategic benefits, just including the efficiency and momentum around considering those legislations. So just again, wanted to point out that Hawaii, Maryland, Washington, and Massachusetts, I think in the interest of time, I won't dive into those, but we will be circulating the slides. Those are 4 states where we've already seen either official companion bills for the first 3 states, or at least 2 bills with identical text in the case of Massachusetts, be introduced in the 2025 session. Next slide, please. Okay. We're going to move on to low carbon procurement. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're pretty good. We're going to leave you time for questions, I promise. All right, so looking at low carbon procurement next. Let's see, could we try the next slide? Wonderful, let's do that one. So these are the low carbon procurement bills that we've tracked again since 2022. You will notice that they pretty much doubled between 2022 and 2023 and then dropped off slightly in 2024. And then a similar story, we are already only 2 months into this session and we're already tracking 15 bills related to low carbon procurement. So we will not be surprised to see numbers that are at least what we tracked last year, if not far above it. Before we dive in, one thing I do want to expand on, Emma had shared a helpful definition earlier in the webinar, but when we're tracking low carbon procurement, we're thinking about it in 2 different ways. Primarily, we're looking for cases where the state is using their purchasing power or their broader budget power, or a combination of both, as a tool to support that transition to lower carbon materials, products, and practices. So one bucket that this could fall into would be the state as the direct procurer. And so in that case, we see them committing to purchasing low carbon construction materials, for example, for different state funded projects. A common example being like a public infrastructure update. This sends a very direct market signal that helps reassure producers that there is a reliable purchaser for these materials, which can help make that transition from current to the lower carbon alternatives easier. And then the second bucket would be when the state, perhaps not explicitly as the direct procurer, is using their budget power to help create market conditions that do support that transition. So some familiar examples of that would include different tax credits or exemptions or other similar programs. And like hydrogen, this is a little bit more of a novel conversation in the States as far as the way that we're seeing it show up in legislation, but we'll dive into that a little bit later. I think what I'll first do, as with hydrogen, many different factors can contribute to the fluctuation we see here. So I do just want to start by sharing again one more example of something happening at the federal level during the period that we were tracking here. Next slide, please. And that is the Federal State Buy Clean Partnership. I'm sure many are familiar with this, so I'll keep it pretty high level. On the left, there's a very generic timeline, but essentially what we want to remind folks is that Executive Order 14057 in December of 2021 charged the Biden administration with launching a Buy Clean task force. This conversation evolved with a convening of many different leaders from 20 different states. And then eventually we saw in March of 2023 the launch of the Federal State Buy Clean Partnership. And this was an alliance between the federal government and the 13 states that you see listed there. I think the important thing to note here is that this type of alliance was designed, again, to create a really strong and consistent market for low carbon materials. And the states that joined were committed to these practices, not only in their own states, but they were committed to collaborating with each other as well as with the federal government. And so again, this effort was to send a very harmonized demand signal to the marketplace. It is worth noting, as many may be aware, that the executive order that led to the activities that developed into the Federal State Buy Clean Partnership was recently rescinded. That said, states have historically been leaders on Buy Clean. This began back in 2017, I think, with California being the first to actually pass a Buy Clean policy. This was a very novel mechanism at the time, but quickly we saw multiple other states follow suit. And we have already seen both Massachusetts and Hawaii introduce bills related to Buy Clean in this legislative session. So one other thing I'll point out is when we look at the states that joined the Federal State Alliance, it's not surprising to see that the states that do have their own Buy Clean policies mirror many of the states on that list. So we will be eager to track the others and see what developments might come out of their future legislative sessions. Okay, next slide. Very wonderful. So now we're going to look at 2024. 17 different bills related to low carbon procurement were considered in at least 8 different state houses. And again, that language of saying at least is truly just because we recognize there may be bills that our keywords didn't grab. So we look forward to you letting us know if you know of any. I'll give you, again, a few moments just to look at this map, but again, you'll notice kind of that narrative approach here when we're discussing trends, and that's simply because Buy Clean has gained a lot of traction in the states just over the past few years. All right, let's go to the next slide. So similar to hydrogen, let's look at some of the trends that we saw in considered but not enacted legislation. And again, we look at this just to start to tell that story. It shows that conversations are happening at the state level. And just a quick anecdote I'll share from Minnesota, which is where I'm located. Buy Clean Minnesota was passed in 2023. That idea of Minnesota Buy Clean was actually first introduced, I believe, in 2018. So it took a process of it being reintroduced, eventually gaining bipartisan support. I believe it was actually a pilot program, and then it turned into the Buy Clean Minnesota policy that was passed in 2023. So just a reference point that sometimes these things do take time. The studies and reports was another trend that we saw, again, in legislation that was considered but not enacted. These are just some of the key words that we pulled out from those bills. Things that I'm sure folks on the call are familiar with, for example, environmental product declarations. And similar to when we talked about hydrogen, this is often directing a designated government body or a third party like a university to study topics related to Buy Clean or low carbon public procurement, and then create some sort of report and report the findings or policy recommendations or other guidelines back within a determined period of time. The second topic or trend was related to financial incentives and support. So 2 examples there, and again, these are just pulled some examples of the 15 or so that were considered. But in Illinois, we saw a bill proposed that would create a performance-based tax credit for low carbon concrete producers. In California, we saw a bill proposed that would allow the state to enter into forward contracts of up to 10 years with low carbon cement or concrete producers. And so in both of these cases, the state is stepping in and supporting and helping to demonstrate market demand for these low carbon materials. And then lastly, expanding the Buy Clean program in California and Washington, where those states already do have their own Buy Clean policies in place. We did see some bills that would go beyond Buy Clean. So I think in the interest of time, keep it very high level here. But the first one was wanting to ensure that companies that were contracting with the state of California were not contributing to tropical deforestation, either directly or through their supply chains. And then in Washington, a bill was proposed that would mandate modeling, measurement, and reporting of embodied carbon emissions in structural building products in state-funded projects. Excuse me, my voice is going. And what was interesting about this particular bill was it was really looking at the life cycle of the project. It emphasized the importance of collaborating very early on in a project to look for different opportunities to innovate or be synergistic so that the overall carbon emissions and energy use of that entire project was looked at from the standpoint of its full service life. Next slide, please. Okay, wonderful. So now we're going to look very quickly at the bills that did indeed pass related to Buy Clean. Trying to keep my eye on the time here. The first one in California, we saw them update the definition of eligible materials. So they deleted mineral wood board insulation and replaced it with just insulation. My understanding, and would love if someone else has a different understanding of it to share, is that making the definition more broad allows for subcategories to be created in the future to create just more nuance beyond a single type of insulation to be included in that Buy Clean policy. In Colorado, we saw them establish the Office of Sustainability. Among other responsibilities, this office will assist with the state's low carbon procurement strategy. Again, Colorado being one of the states with their own Buy Clean program in place. In Massachusetts, we saw them pass a bill to establish an embodied carbon intergovernmental coordinating council, and they were tasked, similar to what we've seen in previous slides, they were tasked with preparing a embodied carbon reduction plan with different recommendations for using environmental product declarations, often called EPDs, in state contracting and procurement. And then last but not least, in Washington, we did see the state pass their Buy Clean, Buy Fair Act, which established both environmental and labor reporting for public building construction and renovation materials. Okay, next slide, please. All right, 2025. So we are already tracking 15 bills related to low carbon procurement across 8 different state houses. Again, I'll just make a plug to please do reach out to us and subscribe to the weekly digest. This is a really great way to stay up to date as movement has already been quick, and we anticipate that we will continue to see a lot of changes on the bills that we've shared on today. Next slide. Okay, last but not least, so looking at 2 states, I mentioned in regard to Buy Clean that we've already seen both Massachusetts and Hawaii propose bills that would create or at least relate to Buy Clean in their states. So in Massachusetts, this bill would create the Buy Clean Massachusetts program. It also establishes a publicly accessible database and would provide financial assistance to help small businesses with compliance. And then in Hawaii, we saw a bill introduced in both chambers. It proposes to for a feasibility study of implementing a Buy Clean state policy and program with a report that would be due no later than 20 days before the start of the 2027 regular session. And then this bill does also reference the Buy Clean programs that exist in other states. It specifically calls out California, Colorado, Oregon, in Washington in the bill text itself. And then just a little bit of background, Hawaii State Energy Office developed a report that was shared last year. And within that report, it was recommended that adopting a Buy Clean state policy would be a key action item to move the state's economy toward carbon neutral. Next slide. Okay, wonderful. That takes us to the end. I've managed to leave you 10 minutes for questions. I hope that's enough. Just one more time, I want to thank you all for being here with us today, and a reminder to subscribe to the 2025 State Legislative Digest. The links are there for previous years that will take you to the tracker But the digest is really where we will be able to keep you updated throughout the 2025 sessions as these bills progress. And that is all I have. I will turn it over to questions.
Thanks, Alana. We'll try to go through these questions chronologically, and then we'll reach out afterwards to answer any remaining questions that we might have. It looks like I have one question from Harry, who asked, as more states implement carbon management legislation, have we seen that it becomes easier or harder for additional states to pass legislation, i.e., are the CCUS supporters or the anti-CCUS proponents gaining more momentum? This one's a little difficult to answer. I think that because of the increased attention we've seen on carbon management, we've just seen a lot more bills in general, both anti-carbon management and those enacting provisions on regulating the technologies or incentivizing them. I do think that we've seen a few more provisions that either increase public notices or hearings or give more protections to communities than we've seen in the past. But I don't know if I could say that either side is gaining more momentum, but there just are more bills in general. All right, we have a question from William. Does GPI do or plan to do any direct engagement in states? We are planning to do some direct engagement in states. This does vary state by state. For example, right now we're working in Texas to draft out a carbon management roadmap for the state and are engaging with a number of expert stakeholders there. And we did something similar in Colorado last year. I think generally wherever there is momentum, we're always interested in providing educational resources to any stakeholders. We don't have any planned direct community engagement quite yet for this year, but those are in the works. It looks like someone asked to share a link to the 2025 legislative digest in the chat. I'm happy to do that. I can share a link to our 2025 legislative tracker. If you'd like to subscribe to the digest itself, please feel free to shoot me or Alana an email. All right, it looks like we have a follow-up question from William asking if we plan to engage with any legislators or bill sponsors, or does GPI take positions on bills? I think generally we're happy to talk with legislators in a more educational capacity. Generally, we try to stay away from taking positions on specific bills. We have sent letters of support on a few bills in the past, but generally we try to remain agnostic if possible. And for whoever asked, I am placing, sorry folks, I just can't see the chat, placing the link to our 2025 digest in the chat. Or it looks like we might have to send this out later. Either way, we'll follow up with everyone after this with a recording to the webinar, slides, and all of the links that we've mentioned today.
And Jacqueline, I see your comment in the chat. Thank you for that, and definitely, yeah, looking forward to connecting on that in the future. Thanks for sharing.
I think we'll leave about 1 more minute for questions. And as always, if anyone thinks of a question they have for anyone on our team, please feel free to reach out anytime. I know that we threw a lot of information at you today.
Thank you, Kelly. Kelly also just dropped our emails in the chat there if you'd like to grab them.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate your time and your engagement and your questions. Like I just said, if you have any questions or any other ideas about how GPI can help support your state level efforts or engagement, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll continue to monitor trends and share updates as legislative sessions progress in 2025. And as always, we just welcome your feedback. So thank you so much.